Ano ai me ke aloha ya kākoa pau, and welcome to our final reflections conversation on our program series Mākau Moʻomeheu, Cultural Competence in Hawaii's Museums. My name is Halena Kapuni-Reynolds, and I am a board member of the Hawaiʻi Museums Association. Over the course of this year, we've hosted multiple conversations and webinars that introduce viewers to the framework of cultural competency as a means to promote collaboration and equity within our local cultural institutions. We also had the opportunity to speak to cultural practitioners and museum professionals working across the Hawaiian Islands, and today we'd like to feature some of the stories and experiences they shared with us during this year-long series. As always, we'd like to thank the Hawaiʻi Tourism Authority for their generous support throughout this entire process, the Hawaiʻi Museums Association, our Cultural Competency Planning Team, which consisted of myself, Helen Wong-Smith, Tarisi Vunidilo, Lisa Solomine, and Frank Hay, and our numerous partnering organizations. Mahalo. Joining me for the last time for this series are my fellow cultural competency educators, Helen Wong-Smith and Tarisi Vunidilo. Aloha no e Helen a me Tarisi. Thanks for joining again. So today, I can't believe that it's been a whole year since we started this program. Can you?
Indeed.
So now that we are at the end of the series, what are some of your overall thoughts regarding your participation in this program? How do you think it went?
Go ahead, Tarisi.
I think it's been a very empowering time for me personally, and I feel like I've really connected with other museums that I would not have engaged with. So that was like something that I've experienced, and I want to share maybe three three-letter I's. The first one is inspire. I've really been inspired by this, and I'm so glad as well that I'm able to inspire others. The other one is indigenous knowledge. It's really wonderful that these webinars and these meetings have allowed us as indigenous people to talk about indigenous things that matter to us. Mm-hmm. And number three, opportunities for us for improvement. And I think that's something that I really like, that we're able to reflect all heritage organizations, libraries, museums, and archives, to think of how we can better our service.
Wonderful. And I'm very appreciative that you brought up the three I's again. Definitely a strategy throughout this entire process. So thank you, Tarisi. Helen?
Well, that's the last time I'm going to let her go first, because Tarisi, she always does it so succinctly and beautifully. I'm not going to come up with three E's, because my whole thing is enlightenment. I mean, although I give this training, it's been very focused on the precepts of cultural competency, but this series has allowed me to interact with such diverse points of view, and that in itself is enlightening. And just the examples, the pragmatic things that Tarisi has done across the Pacific, and your examples of what it can be done here at home, and the practitioners, oh my gosh, just the diversity of experiences and viewpoints, the different viewpoints. And I think so much about how, for instance, Mikiala had said, what is applicable to one island is not necessarily the same. And I think that is something that I've embraced. So, good. Enlightened, embraced. I've got two.
Wonderful. And you transition us nicely to our first kind of selection of clips. So here are some of our favorite moments with our guest speakers over the past year. Let's take a look.
The old folks would describe him as akamai, that he is smart, because there are other vocabulary that would describe him. For example, we would say akamai nui, that means one is competent, but now there's a lot more. And then there's another word, hohonu, that means the old folks are talking about the level of the depth of the knowledge. So competence can be explained in a Hawaiian, by Hawaiian, maikai, akamai, those are layers. And then ikinui, so he has lots of more. And the akamai and akamai loa, and then hohonu. And then finally, hohonu mekaha. That's very high. That's spiritually high now. That's what competence is, from a Hawaiian perspective, with vocab and being described, are defined with Hawaiian words.
I was really lucky to grow up in the halau where, like the ho'ike or the like exhibiting your work is constantly happening, like on a daily basis. In addition to the practice you're doing, the adornments that you're wearing, all of that is like your work, your foot movements, your hand movements, and all of that stuff. And you're sort of like, when you're dancing, you're always on display in a sense. And so my gallery space has always been, in showing my work, has always been like stages, oceans. I mean, it's everything becomes your gallery space. And then now when my work is, I mean, I'm still dancing, but still now I have other kinds of work where they're a little bit more, not necessarily tangible, because the other stuff was tangible, but works that are presented of mine where maybe my face doesn't play a part in it. Then the gallery spaces, become museums and shops and those kinds of things.
I grew up listening to my tutu tell me stories, and I also grew up believing that my father was the smartest person in the whole wide world and he knew everything. And our education system is really designed to remove the authority in our families and shift that authority over information and knowledge to the classroom. And we, even today, we yield so much of that authority to things like cell phones and smartphones and Google for answers. And so I think even as institutions, museums have been afforded a place in our society to be an authority on information. And we're realizing now that there's a big shift where people are doing their own research and sort of contradicting some of the things that we've said or done and put out. And I realized that as a Lāhui, as a community, we have yielded that authority over our own stories to someone else to tell. And we need to start reclaiming some of that.
So much of the history of museums, it's loaded with a lot of non-native bias or prejudice. Almost, I'll use the generous term of sort of unconscious bias or prejudice. And everything was stones, bones, some facets of material culture, and someone who was not a part of that culture being the translator of language, putting it into place. This is what it's about. And well, we know more about this because we've studied it than anyone who's living today. Bad attitudes to have. And we see that, and we see that there is a change occurring. For us on Lānaʻi, it's our work as a community organization, really grassroots organization, started first because the community wanted something that would help promote its history. It recognized that change was occurring quickly on island. But here's the interesting thing. Those who were most alarmist about the changes were those also who were tied to a period of history that spanned only from 1923 to the present day of a previous owner who took charge of Lānaʻi in 1985. And they were concerned that they were going to lose their plantation history, forgetting that there were 1,000 years of Native Hawaiian history, at least on Lānaʻi, prior to the plantation. And so we end up with things like Garden of the Gods, Shipwreck Beach, or Lanai. Makaolero ko makopo ikupuna makela mokupuni o karulao o Lānaʻi kapuana polore.
Once Pila Kikuchi, Moses Keale, Dr. Emery, all of them in the 50s, I believe it was, went into Molokai to preserve the artifacts that were coming out of the cliff or you know, and I actually, I thank them for that. I thank them for securing these things of beauty, because at that time, I believe there was a very hot market, a black market, if what you say, what you would call it, for artifacts of, from not just from Hawaii, but from all over, and to be held in private collections. So on the personal side, I appreciate that these things were preserved, that we are able to see them today, but bringing it into today, part of our thinking is that the museums have enough now. If these things fell out of the cave, up in the cliff, for instance, the birds may have kicked them out, then we will find a way to return them. And that makes me a little nervous, because those caves are really high, and I don't have the rope ladders in place, and and the scaffolding and all of that. And we would need to, if we're going to do that, we need to do it somewhat under cover of darkness, so that the whole coast and everybody on it couldn't see what we were doing, where we were doing it. There's a lot that we need to talk about. We're going to do that kind of thing.
Right, we all agree that what defines Mea Vaivai is the function of it. And so when they're kind of put out, when they're rested, when they're allowed to retire from that primary purpose, and they're put in a place to sort of preserve them, that their desire to continue to be of service to their community continues. Their desire to be inspirational, to be loved, to be seen, to be embraced, it persists. And so I think for us being aware that so I'll give you another, I'll just share a little mo'olelo. We did an exhibition about makahiki, and we talked about ulumaika, and we wanted to mix the case. So in that case were traditional, museum collections, right, of ulumaika. But my daughter had a beautiful ulumaika made by Kunani Wuten that was a gift to her. So I asked her, do you mind letting your little ulumaika share space with these kupuna, right? Because they want to hang out together. And so she agreed, right? She was young.
Every item, even a stone, has a story. And have we recorded that story? So when I have children, classes that come to me, I have this squid lure. It used to have a bone on it for a hook. Well, never caught any he'e. So Papa changed it to a metal hook. But I always told the children that here, this bone was once there, but never caught any he'e. I drop it on the floor. And that lure will turn with the weight at the bottom. If you know what the lure is like, it's a stone that's kind of half with a little groove, and that is attached to a cowrie shell. When you drop it into the hole where the he'e is, or the squid, octopus, it will land stone down, cowrie shell up on the top. Okay? When the he'e pounces onto that because they want to get the animal out of that cowrie shell, boom, you hook it. Okay? If you get a little one, no problem. Just stick your finger underneath, pulley the thing over, paralyzed. But if you get a big he'e with 8 tentacles, it can wrap you with their tentacles. And when I ask the children that, they go, oh, you know, and in all of the years that I have worked at the Visitor Center, which is nearly 22 years, only 9 people have ever told me what you get, how do you paralyze a he'e that has wrapped you. You're out on the reef, you don't have a hammer. Chucky boy, do you know that? Okay. Sabra, how about you? What was this?
The eyes,
With your fingers?
if that's all you have.
You bite the eye.
I couldn't.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine the facial expressions when you tell children that? You bite the eye. Maybe your hands are all wrapped up, so how it's bite the eye.
Crunch.
And it will paralyze you. So, to me, our artifacts have to be labeled, even though they're not on display.
Those are beautiful selections of videos, and I'm sure we can learn so much from them. And that leads us very well into our next segment. Throughout our programs, we've asked our practitioners and knowledge holders to reflect on how Hawaii museums can improve. Now, to Halena and Helen, I will ask you these questions. How can Hawaii institutions continue to improve? Halena?
Thank you, Tarisi. It's been such a pleasure to hear other folks and their comments and experiences working in museums, because it shows that we still have a lot to do. There's never not enough work. There's always going to be multiple projects, multiple things that need to take place within our institutions if we're going to achieve the kind of equity and safe workplaces that we want for not just ourselves, but for future generations of locals and Native Hawaiians working within these kinds of institutions. And so one of the big improvements that I heard throughout this series was this notion of access, that there is still a need for creating opportunities, not just for practitioners, but for families and individuals and communities to know about our collections and to be given the opportunity to be with those collections and be with those objects and to reconnect with things that came from their community, from their family, or from someone that they care deeply about. So that was one of the things that I pulled out from our conversations with our practitioners.
Mahalo, Halena. And Helen?
I agree wholeheartedly with Halena, and I also saw a big need for collaboration. So often as just a result of giving them the space, giving the practitioners the space to join us and giving them the opportunity to express their needs. They were not aware that certain possibilities. Oh, you have this, we have that. You are looking for this opportunity, we have that resource. Or you have this in your collection, we would love to be able to. So the need for collaboration was repeated so often throughout the series. So this is something that I think that I know we're very busy trying to keep the doors open and such, but to broaden our minds so that this collaboration can take place. And I think that if we make that shift, that will be an improvement. Everybody rises.
Absolutely. I think I'd agree completely. And I just want to say one more thing, is that I think throughout this series, what we've come to kind of realize is that conversations are still important. I mean, you still have people who are like, I'm tired of talking. I just want things happening. But throughout this series, we've seen how much these conversations have not only allowed us to address these needs within our institutions, but also the desires of those who we'd want to collaborate with. And to see that, there are multiple ways in which we can achieve what we want to do within our organizations when we have those conversations, when we sit down with each other, and when we create those opportunities for folks to meet one another, but to also, potentially create projects for themselves to work on.
Absolutely. Wow, those are really, really good points, covering the important points of access and the important points of collaboration. Eh? So let's take a look at some of the amazing suggestions and improvements shared to us by our knowledge holders.
But, the interaction with the community is almost a two-way education, because the folks that are living culture are the resource to make things, brighter, clearer, better. But the keepers of artifacts and the shepherds for some of these sites, they have their own protocols and science as well. And to make the folks out in the field more aware of that, I think that interchange is invaluable. Because, part of the reason that a doer, and I'm not fond of the term practitioner, because most of the doers are done practicing, they're just doing it. But they're not necessarily long-term shepherds. Some of these collections have actually been kept safe for a couple of hundred years, through a set of protocols that have become a science in a way. So it takes a certain level of training to do that. And having the community, the practitioners, be familiar with what some of those restrictions, some of those foundations are, that's what allows the conversation to really become productive, probably. So I think that interchange can be a two-way piece. We certainly can learn. I do want to, a thing about reaching out to the community, get your stuff and come in and do your job. Kawaʻa Kumukahi was a great mentor for me in language. And we were doing a radio show trying to provide public language. And he would introduce me to native speakers that, to try and cajole them to be guests on. Nobody wanted to be a guest on a radio show, come on. But we had gone down into Puna and we met with the Kaʻa family, with delightful resource people, weavers, language resources extraordinary. And when he brought up the subject, he said, no, we're over it. We're over it. The university keeps coming. They film us for an hour and they think they got us. Some student comes and, we answer their question. They think they got it. We never find out if they got their degree or their grant or their program or that. It was so extractive. And you don't have to be an outsider to be extractive. You can be just from a different zone. So that notion of interaction being mutually beneficial has to sort of frame, I think, the interplay with the community. That's probably enough said.
The question brought to mind something Pokea said earlier about access. And so how can the institution, the gatekeepers at the museums, for example, assist those of us who are thriving outside in the dirt and in the lo'i and in the caves and whatnot, not because we work for it or are even interested in museum archiving work, but Pokea talked about access. And so my message would be allow access, facilitate access. Don't make it difficult for us. Because Pokea was exactly right. There was a day where when you were a member of the community, you wanted to access stuff that wasn't on the display behind the glass case. You have to start with the assumption the answer is going to be no. And for all these decades, you have to assume the answer is just going to be no. And they will throw all kinds of excuses why no, or just not say anything. It has been the case where you are met with silence, a wall of silence. That would, that's how cheese, because like you said earlier, knowledge is money, yeah? So no, we will not allow you access. That used to belong to my community. You know what I'm saying? You don't deny me access to what used to belong to my own community. So for locals, we get angry, It makes us angry to be denied access. But facilitating access, and I mention it this way because I've already seen in the past number of years the shift, the swing to allowing facilitation. And I'm very happy that there has been this swing. It really is different than what it used to be. And it's been great to be welcome in the back doors of Bishop Museum and other museums?
From the Park Service, I would agree with what Mahealani is saying, is that, you know, we need to tell the stories, the hard stories that had happened even in establishing our parks in Kalokohonoko, how, you know, displacement of the Hawaiian families that were there before the park became the park. Same thing at Hawaii Volcanoes, to tell that story, to give that foundation for visitors and our local people too. I don't know how many people know about the history of Hawaii Volcanoes, but you know, there's a really sad story about those people from Kealakomo having their lands taken away from them, and when the Park Service wanted that land, and then never taking the compensation because they never wanted to sell that land. So those stories need to be told.
There should be times where these folks to engage in the local community and be immersed in the local culture. Spend time in those communities. You never know. I think that'll help them spend time in those communities. Talk to the people. Try to understand them. Try to understand that unique Ahupua'a history and go and mingle, engage them. You never know.
I think a big part of the work museums do when they engage with communities, and when you know, communities are able to help create and guide these narratives, especially in Hawaii, I think in a lot of places it's important to show you know, that these cultures, their narratives are you know, kind of educated on, or what's a good way to say it, demonstrated or expressed through the institutions, but the institution cannot define these cultures and these things. You know, for Hawaii, for Kanaka Maoli, you know, we are still a living culture. We're still changing, you know, between generations, between the years, as our climate changes, as our world changes, as our political backdrop changes. You know, it's important to acknowledge all the steps we've gone through, you know, throughout our past, leading up to where we are now, and in allowing that story to continue, because the story is going to continue with or without the museums. But for museums, for that culture, that institutionalized culture, to really engage community, I think it's important that it becomes a vehicle for these stories, you know, to continue to be told and to be added to. You know, nothing is set in stone. You know, we learn from our past mistakes and we make ourselves better. The way Hawaiians did things in the time of Liloa was different from how they did things, you know, generations down the line by the time of Lono Hikamakahiki. And that changed by the time Kalani Pu'u and Kamehameha come along. And, you know, then we had our monarchy. And so things are constantly changing. And I think museums have an important role to play in showing that this culture is going through a living evolution. You know, we're a living culture, we're not a museum culture. We're not like the pharaohs of Egypt, where all that's left is what's inside a glass case. You know, we're still here talking and breathing and doing Hawaiian things.
You know, I mentioned the excitement that I had for the Bishop Museum, having the recognizing the knowledge core, you know, those three pillars. But I think, you know, internally we have been trying to find ways to strengthen that component of the living culture component and in the museum. And recently we have kind of formalized a group known as the Cultural Knowledge Group. We call the group is called Hui Imi Ike Pono. And within this group here in the museum, it consists of museum staff that are knowledge bearers in various forms, in their various practices. But again, it's bringing in that indigenous kind of way of practice, of not basing one's decision off of a single person, but actually getting advice from a group of people on aha. Yeah, you're having advisors come in and really discuss and have that conversation with one another and provide a collective thought, instead of just having a single person make a decision for everyone, based off of their own individual experience. So I think that's something that we've been working hard at the Bishop Museum anyway, to try and increase that conversation of bringing in indigenous perspectives and addressing those things from that form. But I think that's also a very important thing that should be addressed across institutions on Oʻahu, and having the institutions address that subject relevant to their own personal institutions. Yeah, so not having a general perspective of indigeneity or whatever being incorporated into the museum, but how that really is can play a strong role in increasing each individual institution's history and story and connection to the community.
What if the museum says, we have this artifact and we want these artifacts to go out into the community and go into schools, and let's say a board, a poi board, or it might be something else, whatever that is going to, and then we attract students from that's close to the museum who are interested in museum work, and then they be placed on what is called directed studies, and then so that the museum would say, to be a museum person, these are the areas of study that you need, and so I would say I want to do a poi board, and I would take it to Hauʻula, and then the museum people would say, you need to learn all of these, the different kinds of stones you have to learn to present, but don't do it just one time over there, because that's hanapono. I mean, pono no hana. Is there? And we don't do it just a one-time show, that it is a 3-part. And so it may be talking about board, is about the ko'i, and the kids actually get to make it. And then but the idea is for education to attract students who might be interested in the field of that study, and call it directed studies for them. And the other is to take museum pieces out into the field and to make it.
Each repository that we have, not only on Kauaʻi, but throughout the state, is for us to know each other, to support each other. Like, I met Mr. Kawamura, but only by phone, but I'd like to know what he looks like, at the Veterans Museum. Right. He's one of the historians there. So a lot of these people, you talk to them by phone, but we need to support each other and know each other and know what stories each repository tells. It's like for Kauaʻi, we tell our Kauaʻi stories, all of us. And we all have our unique stories, the stories of the Vahipana, or the specific areas, the special places in their area. But who are these people that are the caretakers? We want to know. We should meet each other because we want to support each other. So if friends go to Moku o Keawe and says, oh, you got to go see Brother Kimo at Lyman Museum, when you tell them Kauaʻi said aloha, things like that. I believe that we are in the same ohana, but we need to know each other. There was a museum I went to in Honolulu, and I took my staff, and I said, can we get a discount? They said no. And I said, okay. But if they came here and they work for an institution, we would allow you to come. We share the aloha. Things like that. We need to know each other. I think so. I'm not scolding, but just I think about stuff like that, because we were just saying, ohana, puna is our po.
I hope you were as inspired by those clips as we are. in addition to areas of improvement, we also asked our speakers to talk about the future of our museums, as well as the advice they would give to students. Tarisi and Halena, I'm going to start off with Tarisi. What advice would you give to students?
Yes, I think one of the letter C that I've been sharing quite a lot, which adds on to what you said before, is collaboration and working with others, which I really, really love. I think I reflect on that statement, which no man is an island. So I think it's important that students should feel that they're not alone, that there are other people out there that they can work with, and never to be afraid to ask questions. The other letter C I was going to share is to encourage a culture of learning. You know, they have to be eager to learn new things and never be afraid of learning something that they're not familiar with. I think that's something that I really want to encourage them. And my last letter C is to be proud of their culture and their heritage. And I think that's something that is important for our Indigenous students that are listening in. Be proud of who you are, your language, your heritage, anything that makes who you are, be proud of it.
It's beautiful, and thank you for the C's. It's so much easier to remember. Halena, you know, you're relatively new in your profession, as accomplished as you are, and so what would you recommend to other students as well?
You know, this is something I think about quite often as a person going through the field myself, who has had multiple opportunities to not only develop skills within the museum sector, but to also just understand the inner workings of the institution. You know, oftentimes when we critique museums, it's this umbrella idea of an institution as opposed to really thinking about the individuals who are at the heart of those institutions. And my advice would be to not be quick to judge institutions, especially if, you know, they may be taking a very long time to do something, or they're not being as quote unquote decolonial as we'd like them to, but to recognize and understand that oftentimes these are institutions where folks are there because they love the work that they do. Folks are there because they've committed decades or even years and decades to that workplace because they believe in that mission and vision. And it's not to say that that mission and vision can't improve. You might be the person to come into the institution to make those changes. But if you have the opportunity, get to know those folks, see what their passions are, see what they have to deal with on a daily basis in a nonprofit where money is always an issue because we don't really have nice support within this state for the arts and for museums. But really get to know what their needs are and try to develop that sense of empathy, not just with the professionals, but with those that come and utilize these institutions. Now, the other thing that I would kind of say to students is, I think a piece of advice that I've always valued was to put yourself in uncomfortable situations. Now, when I say that, I mean, you know, if there's an opportunity for you to do something, but you're like, I don't know, I don't think I can do it, I don't have the skill sets, don't let that hinder your participation. Put yourself in that place where you're forced in some ways to learn new skills, to develop a practice of doing or finishing projects. And this will help you in the long run, because at the end of the day, having these multiple skill sets will benefit you, even if you're not working in an institution. I mean, wearing multiple hats is a thing. So you want to be able to wear those multiple hats. But, you know, even if you don't end up in a museum, those skill sets will continue to help you as, you know, you progress through your career. And it's also about just making sure that when you work at places, that you enjoy your work. You don't want to go somewhere and constantly feel like you're being attacked or I don't know what I'm doing. You know, be brave in those spaces, have conversations, meet people, be open to change, be open to hearing. You know, those are the ways in which we can implement and practice cultural competency on the everyday basis, as well as in our chosen career paths.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so glad you brought up to be open to and learning from the people who have been there a long time. I just finished a article with several other archivists about multi-generational, and that was the whole thing, is that these younger people think, oh, you've been here forever, everything's status quo, you're out of it, you're not connected to what's happening now, and not realizing what they have gone through, how many times they may have tried to instill or effect change, and they've, for whatever resources, lack of resources or administration, they were not able to. So thank you for bringing that up so much. Our cultural practitioners also had wonderful advice to students of what to do. And so we'll take a look at some of their suggestions now.
You don't realize that by volunteering, you acquire so much knowledge. Yeah. Bishop Museum I did dusting. I did a lot of dusting. Filing. Because I print well, I made signs. We didn't have typewriters that enlarged it, so I did calligraphy for them. And so that was my experience. So that's why I'm interested in not only library, I'm also interested in preserving our Hawaiian culture.
I've always encouraged my students to follow your interests. If your interests are in the ocean, volunteer with something related to the ocean. If your interest is in cooking, volunteer, Just go into those areas, put a little time in to see if that's really what you want to study, and what really, really excites you is volunteer.
Bravo. Chucky, volunteer opportunities at the Kauaʻi Museum?
It happened. But what cool Kauka and Puna shared about volunteering, I've never heard that growing up. I was just a jock. I was into sports. I was selfish. I always wanted to play ball, and I don't think Papa ever told me that. I always had to help him, but I never, nothing to do with volunteer. But fast forward to hear Puna and you talk about volunteer, I think it's so important, because if you speak to 10 kamali'i, 10 keiki, and you talk about volunteering, if one of them listens, that one is the one that, you spoke volumes to. And it's inspiring to have people like you to inspire kids, because you never know who's going to listen. And I tell that to my daughters too. Volunteer, but they're still learning about volunteering, so important to volunteer. And I think that, and Haname Tapu'uvai, that day comes, you will work with your heart. I think that's important, that no agenda, you come with this. I think that's very Hawaiian.
Going back to college at age 30, I'm walking in three worlds, the language and culture, the music, and then the technology. And each one of them has fed the other. So in addition to the skills and knowledge that they need for the museum work, as Kokoa pointed out, the cultural understanding, the protocols, the language aspects, and in many cases you are dealing with Hawaiian language materials, the technological side, the educational side. So I think, in that field, having that kind of set of tools to your repertoire is incredibly valuable.
I don't know, just go get them. Don't be afraid, because I think, for me, I was never afraid of museums because I grew up around them. But I've seen enough, being at the museum on a multitude of different occasions where you find, from kupuna to younger generation come in and feel timid and just have, this is just maybe on the social emotional side, where people, they come in thinking, it's a museum, like I can't touch, I can't, like I'm afraid to ask questions, there's just perception that the answer is going to be, no, don't touch, you can't do this, you can't do that. And again, I think because of the new leadership that we're finding in a lot of our museums across the state, and just collection, management processes in general, are breaking that perception and making people feel comfortable and feel that they have a sense of place, that can develop a sense of place, and knowing that likely a lot of the things or some of the things that might be in there are of their kupuna. And so I just, I see that paradigm shift happening. I obviously wish things would happen faster and people would access and intern and engage in their local museums more. But little by little, it's happening, and I appreciate that.
And I would tell them to look within their own family and to see what kinds of things or collections they might have in their own family. And so the example I give is, like in my own family, my father was born in 1893. He was a lot older than my mother. And so in the late 1890s, early 1900s, there was this big craze for collecting land shells. And my father was a land shell collector. And when he passed away, Bishop Museum actually asked us for his collection. And my mother at the time chose to keep it in the family. So we still have that collection. But now that I'm older and we don't have children to pass it on to, my nieces and nephews aren't so interested in it. I'm looking actually for a place to put them where they can, be treasured by future generations. So I would say, look at what you have and then try to work with other repositories to learn about them and see how you can care for them yourself within your family. And just the education itself is worthy, I think, that you learn. Just caring for your own family collections.
Be persistent. I think it's be persistent in pursuing what you think you're headed towards, and work hard at it, and be persistent with museums, the repositories, and opening their doors, kokua them, become a member. Well, and most of all, I think, is, again, taking that step. Mm-hmm. No matter what kind of place it is, no matter what you think of it, you need to take that first step to go there. Mm-hmm. And I did have an experience with one student like that, who was from Oʻahu, who's Hawaiian, and we were working on the conservation of some Hawaiian artifacts, which we will have on exhibit. And this student was from Oʻahu, Waianae, and I had him work on rehousing kapa beaters and making the boxes, stabilizing the object in there. And these are, historic kapa beaters. And we were probably in a month, maybe less than a month of work. And then he came, I was showing him how to do the boxes and then putting the kapa beaters in them. And he goes, "Auntie, it's not what they say. It's not true." And I said, "Huh? What's not true?" And he says, "It's not true what they say about museums, that they don't like, that, we cannot touch these things and we cannot see it, or, they just tick, tick, tick." I said, "Oh, okay." I think his name was Carlos. And, I felt really good because I said, if you get that just by being here and helping out, I think it's important. It makes me feel good that at least it's changed your perspective. And I think, so it has to be two ways. And that made me feel really good to hear that. And I love working with college students. They're just like a sieve, sort of. And you can talk, you can share a lot. And I think being at the Lānaʻi Museum, I think it's important for them to know things. And we are the holder of keys. And we should be able to open the doors for the ones who are there knocking. Yeah.
Be present, be participatory, and
and be curious and figure out what your practice is so that you have a lens. Because I think that, you know, like, I don't think I chose to join hula, but that's where I went. And my hula lens has, I can't imagine what I would be without the hula lens. So definitely find your practice and practice it.
Save your money and apply for every grant that you could possibly apply for. Travel and visit all of the most awesome museums, not only in Hawaii, but around the world. Te Papa Museum in Aotearoa, I was fortunate enough to be there in Aotearoa when they opened the museum. I think is a really beautifully designed modern style museum. And I also think a side talent to museum studies is technology. Educational technology, because that is going to be part of the future of museums, and I think a new student coming in is going to be a part of that phenomenon. So that would be my 2 cents. And then bury your feet deep in the aina over here.
I say be passionate, you know, whatever you're interested in, as long as you have a passion for it. And I think that a lot of times we're told, you know, you have to be professional or keep your personal life separate from your you know, your personal life and your professional life separate. But I think anybody who works in the museum field knows, right? You bring that all with you. You bring your own personal history, your family history, your community history. I mean, and a lot of times you're the face. You end up being the face of the museum to everyone in your life. And you know, so in that sense, I think these are that we're capable of melding those two in a way that's really powerful. And the one thing that I will forever be grateful to Bishop Museum for was allowing me to create Under a Jarvis Moon and to do that Hui Hanala'au exhibition, which was a tribute to my grandfather and his generation, all of whom are gone now. So to think that we did this exhibit that recognized what these young Hawaiians did in the 30s and 40s, and it lives on, you know, it lives on for their family members, it lives on for the community. So there's something so powerful about museums and their ability to be memory keepers. And that anybody who goes to museums, either for a short time in their life or for the rest of their lives, you know, it's such a gift, and you will learn so much about yourself and your community, because that's where so much of this knowledge resides, right? Untapped, waiting for us to discover.
That's really, really beautiful. And it's not that repository is a dead space, or the historic site is a dead space. It's a place to, in a way, discover and rediscover, you know, who you are today. So, and how, you know, that information impacts your life. Hanalei, please, your thoughts. What advice would you give to young people?
Yes. You know, for me, I was very fortunate to have had parents that were very supportive of what I wanted to do with my life, and not kind of push me in a direction that just provided me stability financially or all of those other forms, but really allowed me to follow my passion, like Noelle said. And I think that's something that I would say, you know, follow those things that really excite you and bring you joy. You know, follow those desires. And you know, for me personally, you know, coming from my own experience, you know, that has brought me to where I am today. You know, it has allowed me to be the person that I am, and experience the world that I have in the way that I have. So to have that confidence in who you are, and follow those again, like Noelle said, passions and dreams and hopes. And you know, if you have those things, reach out to institutions like the Bishop Museum. You know, don't feel like you have to only wait for a program to show up on a flyer or on a website or wherever it is. Ask, call the museums or wherever institution that draws you to connect with, because that's always going to be you will be greatly surprised that there's always going to be an open door to access institutions. There's always going to be people needing help in those institutions, and finding those ins into those institutions is just a call, and finding that connection.
No laila e nā hoa, ua hoʻea kākou I ka hopena o keia papahana. We've reached the end of our program series, and we'd like to thank you for supporting our programs and the Hawaiʻi Museums Association throughout this endeavor. If at any time you'd like to revisit our conversations, please visit our webpage at www.hawaiimuseums.org/Macau or the Hawaiʻi Museums Association YouTube page. Mahalo also to Helen and Tarisi for their work on this ambitious project, as well as for sharing their experiences throughout this year. It has been a pleasure. And special thanks to Hawaii Tourism Authority, the Hawaiʻi Museums Association, and our cultural competency team, which included myself, Helen, Tarisi, as well as Lisa Solomina and Frank Hayes. Thank you, Lisa and Frank, for all that you've done as well. If you'd like to stay involved with the Hawaiʻi Museums Association, consider becoming a member. We'd love to have you as part of our ohana. Ahui ho, and until we meet again.